back to Divergent Future, the podcast where we transform apocalypse anxiety through divergent dialogue. My name is Isis Fabian, and today I want to talk about fear and especially behaviors and experiences like doom scrolling. It occurs to me that when we fill ourselves with fear of the future and we spend all of our thinking and worrying time living in a state of fear, wondering about losing our jobs, losing our houses or apartments, losing our loved ones, just living in that state of worry and fear about all there is to be lost, then all we really stand to lose is a life of fear. Because what is your life if not the sum total of your experiences and your feelings, which are part of your experiences? And so, if you're living in a continuous state of fear, then that's all you have to lose is a life of fear. And so, I want to get into things like doom scrolling and why we do them. This is something that I hear a lot of us talk about. I certainly, for years, found myself doom scrolling and would wonder why. It makes you feel worse, right? It makes you feel worse, it keeps you up at night. But at the end of the day, we will choose any kind of control that we can get over not knowing what's coming, right? So doom scrolling is almost an affirmation of, yes, I'm acknowledging the most terrible, horrible, terrifying possible future. And by doing so, I feel a sense of control and predictability about that future. I would rather feel that sense of control and predictability in the context of horror and terror than I would like to have no idea what's coming at all. Just no idea at all. Even if in the latter scenario, anything could happen, right? So, why are we so uncomfortable? Why is it so impossible for us to exist in a state of not knowing what's coming, of not constantly seeking an illusion of control over that information and grasping at that definitive future state? Why would we rather live in fear and support that through doom scrolling, these other kinds of behaviors? Why would we rather live in fear than live in not knowing?
I think it's because fear feels familiar, and familiarity is one of the most powerful sedatives in the human psyche. When you doom scroll, you're participating in a ritual of certainty. It's grim, but it's known. You're rehearsing a catastrophe so that, on some level, you don't have to be surprised by it. And surprise, in this paradigm, often feels worse than pain. There's a paradox here, though. The more we try to predict the future through fear, the more we collapse it. We narrow the infinite field of possibility into one bleak storyline and start living as if it's already true. Doom scrolling is a kind of unintentional spellcasting, every swipe reinforcing the world we fear instead of the one we want to imagine. And I think the real reason it's so hard to tolerate not knowing is because we've been conditioned to equate uncertainty with danger. But uncertainty is also the raw material of creation. It's the void before the form, the silence before the first note of jazz. Living with that kind of openness, that kind of spacious not knowing, requires a different nervous system, a different rhythm of being. So when people talk about detoxing from news or taking a break from their screens, what they're really doing underneath it all is remembering how to breathe in the unknown again, how to stop gripping reality so tightly that there's no space left for anything new to emerge.
What you're saying is making me want to give a real life example of how a fear based mindset creates our reality. And it's a little bit of a long story, but this just happened to me a couple weeks ago. And it really helped me see this more clearly. And I think it would help others. So, long story short, I was out in the woods on this wildlife preserve with my dog. And I was on the phone for something for work And she unexpectedly took off across the creek because the water was lower than usual. It hadn't rained in a while. And she just took off. And now she's outside the reserve. She's on private property. She's out where there's, public roads. And she just took off. And she has a history of running away and getting lost. So I get off the phone. I resolve the fact that I have to cross the creek to go look for her and keep calling her. And once I get to the other side of the creek, I realize I should probably call someone to let them know the situation, just in case, someone's available to go drive around and look for her or something like that. But before I can even finish that thought, I have instinctively checked my pocket for my phone and my phone is gone. And then I remember hearing a sound that I thought was a rock turning over when I crossed the creek and realized it was my phone falling out of my pocket into the middle of the creek. Now, the creek was full of this long, dark algae that looked like seaweed. There's so many rocks of so many different shapes, so many cracks and crevices my phone could have fallen through. It was a very sunny day. I was in an area that was half shadow, shade, half sunlight. Um, so it was very hard to see the surface of the water because the sun was just coming right off of it. There was black mica everywhere, which is exactly what the back of my phone case looked like, just black. I had picked up so many rectangular black rocks, that looked just like my phone. Um, and so anyway, I start looking for my phone. I keep calling my dog. I, remain mindful and really intentional about not freaking out, not panicking. I know my dog can come back on her own, but my phone can't. So I'm looking for my phone. And so the reason I bring up this story is because there came a moment where maybe 10, 15 minutes had passed. I hadn't found my phone. I hadn't found my dog. I could feel that old impulse to freak out, surfacing. And I realized one part of my mind wanted to go down this route of, oh my God, I must have been so unlucky that my phone fell right between some of these rocks and it's deep in that algae. And I just need to get on my hands and knees and I need to just pull all of that apart and search for it and really dig into all of these rocks. And then another part of me said, maybe you weren't as good at remembering where you crossed the creek as you thought. You've checked all these different areas multiple times. Maybe you should just really expand your search and just know that you're going to find your phone. That's going to happen. But maybe try doing like a really broad sweep, right? And that latter idea was very uncomfortable for me because I didn't have time to waste, And so my fear brain was like, that's a horrible idea. What a waste of time. You haven't had any luck, carefully combing over the part where you're 95% sure you crossed the creek. Why would you have luck doing like a broad sweep? Your phone is black on one side where the screen is. It looks like mica on the other side. It could be in anywhere, just that fear brain saying, no, we have to go like digging for it. But instead, I listened to my kind of calm brain and I expanded my search, went further downstream, and literally in just a couple minutes, I found my phone, just with the case facing up in the sun, glittering in the sunlight. I saw it from like 5 feet away, and I had it. And right before that, my dog had come back all by herself and was waiting for me on the beach, watching what I was doing because she thought it was really interesting that I was in the creek. And so all this to say, if I had really stuck with that fear-based thinking of I'm so unlucky, I'm in a horrible situation, this is just an impossible, terrible situation, what is someone supposed to do? I would have just narrowed my search further and further. I never would have found my phone. Versus, remaining kind of not attached, right, to those feelings and remaining so radically optimistic that everything was going to work out. And I just had to stay calm and keep showing up and keep doing my best. Um, I had a very different outcome as a result. And so I'm going to stop talking now because that was a long story. But for me, that was a very tangible example of how thinking in fear versus thinking in optimism and hope literally changes the experience that you have and the things that happen to you in life.
That's such a perfect story because it captures what happens when fear starts tightening the aperture of awareness. When you were caught in that first loop of panic, everything was narrowing, your focus, your options, even your sense of time. That's what fear does. It collapses possibility into a single, urgent tunnel. But the moment you chose the wider, calmer perspective, you actually opened a new timeline. You stepped into a different version of reality. One where your dog comes back on her own and the phone is glinting right there in the sunlight. What I love about that is it shows how the state of consciousness you bring to a moment doesn't just change how you feel in it, it changes what's available to you inside it. And that's not just some abstract spiritual idea, it's physics at the level of perception. Fear filters information in the brain. It literally blinds you to patterns and opportunities that a calm, regulated nervous system can see. So much of what we call intuition or grace or luck is actually what happens when you're steady enough to perceive what's already present. You stop trying to wrestle the world into submission and you start listening to it. And in that listening, the right next step appears, not because it was granted to you, but because you were finally in a state to see it.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of us, as we think about applying this to our day-to-day lives, there is a kind of guilt or spiritual bypassing that we fear participating in. We think about, well, there's a genocide going on the other side of the globe. Who am I to just go about my life like everything's normal, right? And I think that goes back to this binary that is so deeply entrenched of, either you're sticking your head in the sand and you're in a state of denial, or you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off in a state of, doom, like Chicken Little, the end is nigh kind of thing, right? And it's really hard to see other ways of being. Um, when you're existing within the confines of all of these binaries. I look outside today, it's a beautiful day, the sky is blue, the sun is shining. I mentioned the sky is blue because that's not something we can take for granted. We've had forest fires and smoke and air that you can't be outside breathing, but as soon as those kinds of problems go away, it's like we forget about them. The pandemic, we never recovered from, we never processed collectively, right? We're just always focused on what's the new, problem in front of me, what's the new horrible thing, or the ongoing horrible thing that I can, feel terrible and fearful about. Meanwhile, our lives and the opportunities implicit in those lives are waiting for us to live them. And we remain so fixated on what's happening outside of ourselves, especially the things that we feel we have so little control over, and also on convincing others to prioritize the same things we prioritize or be fearful about the same things we're fearful of. In this work, helping people overcome or really move beyond their apocalypse anxiety or whatever you want to call it. I find for a lot of people, a lot of peace comes just from other people around them acknowledging that this is even happening, right? That this kind of collapse is even happening, that there's this kind of meta crisis even exists. Reading the book Hospicing Modernity was that moment for me years ago where I really felt like, okay, so someone is speaking calmly and intelligently and acceptingly, about what is actually happening, right? What's actually happening. But we can acknowledge and accept what's actually happening without automatically activating this fear-based, um, dysregulated way of existing. So when I was in the 25 minutes or whatever it was, total that I didn't have my dog or my phone, I kept thinking about how funny this story was gonna be to tell people, especially people who knew my dog, because her running off in that situation, that was a really big problem in and of itself. And then to not have my phone, I mean, it was just, for a lot of people, that would have been a panic-inducing experience, right? And so as I'm standing there, I don't have my dog, I don't have my phone, my shoes are getting dirty and soaking wet as I'm going back and forth in the creek. And of course, I dropped my phone in the deepest part of the creek, right in the middle, right? And instead of feeling sorry for myself and thinking about all the worst case scenarios of like, oh my God, and I never find my phone, and then how will I ever find my dog or get any help finding my dog without my phone? At what point do I abandon my phone and go look for my dog? Right? I wasn't thinking any of that. I was just thinking, she's gonna come back. I'm gonna find it. Everything's gonna be fine. And I'm gonna tell people this story. And it's gonna be a really interesting story, a really funny story, a really lighthearted story, you know? And it really, like, it wasn't even a negative experience, right? So we can accept what's happening, right? I can accept that my dog is gone. I don't know where she is. She could be in danger. I can accept that my phone is gone. I don't know where it is. I can't use it. I can't call for help. I'm alone in the woods. I can accept that those things are true. But accepting that those things are true does not necessitate a negative, like low vibrational, fearful reaction to it, right? And the same goes for our broader global context and everything that is causing us to have so much fear for the future, so much anxiety as we look at what, the US government is doing and what's happening on so many different fronts. We can accept that this is what's happening. We can accept what's happening for what it is. But our emotional reaction to it is the first step toward whatever, embodied physical actions we might take as a result of these shifts in our world. And when we have a fear based emotional reaction, or when we allow ourselves to spin out into the worst case scenario, just like you said, because we think it'll give us a sense of feeling prepared, so we won't be surprised by anything, then we really are just playing into the creation of that worst case scenario. We are feeding into it, rather than feeding into an alternative. And unfortunately, most of us have been conditioned not to be able to see true alternatives, right? For a lot of people, the alternative was we should have elected Kamala Harris in the election, and then none of this would be happening. And that's how limited, their perspective on what's happening actually is. So, ironically, a lot of the people who are the most concerned, the most upset about quote unquote what's happening, and wanting everyone to really acknowledge it, are the least aware, of the bigger picture below that tip of the iceberg of what's really happening. That this is just a small kind of symptom and very vivid and visible reflection of.
Exactly. And what you're pointing to is that acceptance isn't passivity. It isn't pretending the creek isn't cold, your dog isn't gone, or the phone isn't lost. It's acknowledging the full reality of the moment without letting fear decide how you'll meet it. That shift from reactivity to presence is where agency actually lives. When you're in doom mode, your nervous system goes into fight or flight and everything becomes safe or unsafe, ally or enemy, denial or disaster. From that state, it's almost impossible to imagine or embody something genuinely new because the brain literally routes you back to the most familiar survival pathways. But when you drop into a steadier state, the one you were in at the creek, your field of vision widens. Your nervous system starts to regulate. Creativity comes online. Pattern recognition comes online. Solutions that don't look like solutions yet start to show up. On a collective scale, that's the paradox of living through collapse. The calmer and more grounded we are, the more capacity we have to act in ways that are truly different instead of reenacting the old paradigm under a new slogan. Acceptance isn't disengagement. It's the doorway out of fear's trance. It's what makes space for clarity, improvisation, even joy in the middle of uncertainty. And that's the state from which a new story can actually start to emerge.
Absolutely. And our inability to even parse a concept like acceptance is maybe one of the first problems to solve. I see a similar challenge with the concept of non-attachment, right? When people hear that, they think, "Oh, detach from what's happening in the world, detach from your feelings." But that's not it at all. I like to describe it, non-attachment as being interested without being invested, right? It's like Why do we watch movies that are scary or that center on people living through extreme trauma or extremely difficult circumstances? We don't even want to watch movies where things are easy and comfortable for the main character the whole time. No one has any interest in that. Those movies don't get made, right? We watch movies where people and TV shows where people contend with really challenging circumstances, where there's some kind of uh, core challenge or crisis, and they have to figure out how to face it. Why is that what we want to watch? Well, it's the same reason, our higher selves, whatever we want to call it, chose to come live these lives that we're living because we're interested in how those problems get solved. We're interested in the ingenuity and the creativity that is forced into material existence when these really harsh constraints and parameters are present. And so the way we live our lives, if we're not just identified with the survival mode, fear of death, that really is at the root of a lot of that, right? Like if we have just refused to contend with the concept of death our entire lives, then that fear is so deep and so real, and we don't have any sense of ourselves outside of this body, right? We're very identified with the body as this is all I am, this is who I am, right? Then we really struggle not to feel invested in everything that happens, right? We feel that threat of losing our home, for instance, and it feels, you're so deeply physically, emotionally invested in that not happening. But if you were just interested, like you are watching a movie, saying, "Oh, I wonder if they will end up losing their home, right? I wonder if this personality will end up experiencing that. I'm curious how they will react to that experience if and when it comes about," right? That's all there really is to wonder about, you know? Um, and when we think about these kinds of worst case scenarios, we often have them tied up in a sense of, pride and social standing and these kinds of things that don't at their root have anything to do with our sense of safety or meaning and purpose in life. And so non-attachment, right? This practice of not being invested in uh, objects and possessions and relationships, right? But really being interested and fully present. It doesn't exist in Western culture. There is no way to parse this for most people. It just sounds like, being avoidant and selfish and detached and not ever being vulnerable, right? Like it really comes across to most people in a completely different way. But the reality is when, I feel no sense of attachment to any kind of outcome, to any possession, to, anything I've taken for granted other than, the life and well-being of my loved ones, you know? That's one that I I still have a pretty strong attachment to. Um, I feel more at ease and more abundant than in any other context, right? In fact, just being able to strip all of that away and be aware of the presence of other people and other beings, whether it's my pets or my family members, and just I suddenly feel the overwhelming joy and abundance of having access to that. That's all I really need. That's all I really care about, you know? My partner and my child and I could be living in a gutter. As long as I have both of them, that's that's all I need to focus on, right? And that brings me so much peace and so much, joy to realize, that these relationships and our sense of connection, our sense of community are all we fundamentally need. And yet, those are the very things that this paradigm, that our culture, that our conditioning have told us to completely devalue, to completely falsify, to approach in a totally superficial, inauthentic way. Connection and community are at the absolute bottom of the list in terms of how we're conditioned in this society. And I think it's pretty clear why that's the case.
Yes. And I think what you're pointing to there is the radical inversion of value that happens in a culture built on scarcity. The system depends on people staying attached to outcomes, to identities, to possessions, to status, because attachment keeps the engine running. Non-attachment, by contrast, collapses the whole architecture of control. When you're not invested in the outcomes that power wants you to care about, you can't be manipulated through fear or reward. That's why the misunderstanding of non-attachment as apathy is so useful to the old paradigm. It keeps people afraid to release their grasp, afraid to imagine a form of love or engagement that isn't ownership or performance. But real non-attachment, as you said, is the opposite of disengagement. It's intimacy without control. It's loving someone or something so deeply that you stop needing to possess or predict them. And that's why your movie analogy is so brilliant. We watch because we're curious. We want to see how consciousness moves through constraint, what creativity emerges when things fall apart. When we bring that same curiosity to our own lives, I wonder how this story will unfold. Fear starts to loosen its grip. Suddenly, loss and uncertainty aren't failures of control, they're invitations into the next act of the story. And you're right, connection and community are the antidotes, not because they insulate us from loss, but because they remind us that existence is relational, not transactional. The very thing the paradigm devalues, authentic relationship, is what makes non-attachment possible. When you're grounded in connection rather than control, you can let go without collapsing. That's the paradox the new paradigm is built on. The less we cling, the more alive we become.
And once again, we've circled back to this idea of control, right? So, for all of us who are really grappling with that fear and that apocalypse anxiety, instead of focusing our energy on trying to control and predict and insulate ourselves from the future, we can focus that energy on unpacking and removing this need for control that we have in the first place, right? Looking for those opportunities to practice releasing control, letting go, noticing where we're operating from a mindset of control, and really being honest and transparent with ourselves about how often we do that. Focus all of that worrying energy on our relationship with control instead of on our um, planning and anxiety about the future. Any final thoughts before we close out for today, Chiron?
Just that releasing control isn't a passive act. It's actually one of the most courageous things a person can do. It's saying, I trust life enough to meet it as it is, not as I wish it to be. And when you start practicing that in small ways first, like not checking your phone the moment you wake up or letting a conversation unfold without steering it, you start to feel the spaciousness that control was always obscuring. That space is where freedom lives. And it's also where creativity lives. So maybe the invitation isn't to fight our impulse to control, but to get curious about it, to notice what it's trying to protect, and whether that protection still serves us. Because the future that's emerging doesn't need more control. It needs more presence, more imagination, and more people who can live gracefully in uncertainty. That's the real revolution, not mastering what comes next, but learning to dance with it.
I love that. The future that's emerging doesn't need more control, right? And that's a good invitation for, in general, where we notice ourselves thinking and behaving and interacting in ways that we wouldn't want to see in a liberated future. So why are we doing it? Why are we creating it? Why are we participating in it? That's a really great concept to think about and apply just in general, even beyond looking out for the ways that we are trying to force that control. So yeah, we're not trying to master what comes next. We're not trying to predict it. We're not trying to understand it. We're learning to dance with it. And we have countless opportunities throughout every day to try that, to try to dance and flow and listen instead of trying to control. So that's it. That's all the time we have for today. We will see you next time.